So, Preston, I've been hearing quite a bit lately that there's something called the Lost Tyrion chapter, the Shrouded Lord.
The Shrouded Lord?
Yeah, what's that going on about? Someone sent me a video about this, the George R.R. Martin interview, and apparently this is a quote unquote Lost Tyrion chapter. What's going on with this?
Um, so from what I know about it, no one's read it, but from what
Why
people
has no
say
one read it?
is, well, it was cut. It was cut from A Dance with Dragons. So he
Mm-hmm.
wrote an entire chapter. I mean, he wrote George. I mean, who knows what George R. Martin like actually does and what he because he lies all the time and about about how much he writes and how far he is on his books and stuff. But
How dare
according
you
to
say that? How dare you? Some people
oh
might call
no.
that blasphemous. Don't ever criticize God, Emperor George R. R. Martin.
Right. So George R. R. Martin, claims that one of the reasons that A Dance with Dragons took so long is that he kept writing all of these chapters, and then they were cut. So for
Well, that seems
or
possible. I mean,
started over again. Right. So he claims that like he wrote a whole bunch of Quentin, Victarion, and Tyrion chapters
hmm.
in Slaver's Bay with them arriving at different times because all three of the characters are heading towards Danny, and they end up arriving at certain times. And he was like he was playing with the idea and toying with the idea of them arriving at different times, or in Danny not leaving when she did and stuff like that.
Okay.
And they didn't work, and he settled on the one he had. So there's another chapter that he apparently wrote and cut, which was about Tyrion meeting the Shrouded Lord.
Who's the Shrouded Lord for our audience?
Well, if you remember, as Tyrion heads down the Royne on his pole boat with young Griff and Griff, they hit the festival city of Croyane, which is this you know old dead city from the Roynish Empire, um, roughly based on this planet from Dying of the Light, one of his novels, about it being, which is a dead festival planet. But and then all of a sudden, some things when they make it to Croyane, it's this it's some kind of mystical things start happening. So Tyrion, like the ship ends up perhaps going through a teleportation warp, or perhaps the river changed directions, which is things rivers can do. In fact, the Hudson River in New York changes directions depending on the time of day, and George R. R. Martin did not grow up too far from from there, and so there's a lot of strange mystical things going on, and one of the things is Tyrion imagines meeting when after he falls into the water and he's drowning, and then um, John Connington pulls him out. He has this like hallucination dream, and in this hallucination dream, he meets this mystical character called the Shrouded Lord. And the Shrouded Lord, like they mention the Shrouded Lord in the story before that as this strange character who lives in the around Croyane and controls the Stone Men, all the people that have
Grayscale.
grayscale. And so Tyrion would meet the Shrouded Lord, and the Shrouded Lord would be, kind of like his father. I mean, there might have been some Tywin in it, or maybe he's real or not. Maybe he's this character who's sending telepathic messages to Tyrion. It's hard to say. But then George R. R. Martin thought that the chapter got too fantasy-like and too unbelievable, so he cut it. Plus, A Dance with Dragons was bursting at the seams, and they were looking for chapters to cut. So that one got cut.
So the Shrouded Lord is just like essentially an entire chapter of Tyrion meeting this character, and it's essentially just cut because it's just getting a little too fantasy, and he likes to keep the story grounded.
Right. I mean, for the most part, the Tyrion story in A Dance with Dragons is completely and utterly pointless. Like it doesn't advance. Yes, you get to introduce
What about young Griff and John
you get
Connington and the
you
Golden
get to
Dawn,
introduce young Griff and John Connington.
and reintroduce
Yes.
Jorah into the story as well?
That's true. You get to reintroduce Jorah. Um, but,
You also get to see the situation outside Marine.
sure, sure. But it's also like him hanging out on a boat and him getting kidnapped by slavers and him getting sold into slavery. And, he has all these adventures, but him going down the river and meeting this septa and seeing a big turtle and him talking to Illyrio and, him talking to some guy in a town about the the factions of Volantis. I mean, there's a lot of like extra stuff. There's a lot of world building. It's this travel log, but it doesn't.
It kind of mirrors some of the Brienne chapters where she just literally was just walking around the Riverlands and just getting a lot of like world building information.
Right, exactly. Where she, it goes to Duskendale and things like that, and you're like, and goes up to Cracklaw Point, and yeah, you learn a lot about Visenya, and you learn a lot about the defiance of Duskendale, and it's the same with Tyrion. You learn a lot about the political situation of Volantis. You learn a lot about the Rhoynar, um, but like it's all stuff that doesn't really advance the story that we kind of know, which was how does the War of the Five Kings transition to Dany's invasion, and how does that transition to the invasion of the others? Like that's the prime story, and Tyrion kind of just goes through this world to get to Slaver's Bay, and you learn a lot. You learn a lot about history, and you're introduced to a couple of important characters that are going to be very important. But people don't really praise the Tyrion story of A Dance with Dragons too much. It's not like the Theon story, where everyone's like, "Whoa, that's a great tale." It feels, even though he's traveling from one place to another, you feel like you're spinning your wheels. Like you don't feel like you're going anywhere.
And there are other cut chapters. You mentioned a Victarion and who else?
Well, he cut these chapters because they'd contradict to the ones that were put in. But he apparently wrote a Quentin chapter and a Dany chapter and Victarion chapters, like with them arriving earlier and meeting Dany, and eventually those kind of things were cut, and Barristan chapters were put in with, because he eventually had Dany leaving earlier and Victarion arriving later and Quentin arriving at a certain time and Tyrion arriving later. So, this is what he decided on. And so all of the chapters that would have Dany leaving later or the other characters arriving earlier were gone, apparently. And then he cut some chapters that, he plans on putting in the Winds of Winter, like, the Elaine chapter, the Mercy chapter. There was a fourth Bran chapter in A Dance with Dragons that was cut that we don't know anything about, but it's been pushed to the Winds of Winter. So
I that kind of annoys me. I kind of wanted the definitive director's cut version of these novels, because I'm sure he's also cut other chapters in other books as well.
yeah, so if he had an original outline for what A Dance with Dragons was going to be, he really failed miserably in achieving like that outline. So keep in mind that he thought it was going to be one book, and so he thought it was going to start where it started and then end, with the Battle of Ice and the Battle of Fire, like finished and done. And he didn't get to that point. Like the Battle of Ice and the Battle of Fires got pushed to the next book. All these sample chapters got pushed to the next book. So
Well, when we think of the Battle of Ice, we're thinking Jon versus Ramsay in the show, but in the books,
yeah,
it's just Stannis versus the allied forces of the Boltons and the Freys,
right,
with a little bit of the Manderleys sprinkled in there.
right. So his original intention was to have a one book story finish with that, like a conclusion to that battle, and then starting the next book anew with kind of a new feel. I mean, when you look at the first three books, which again he still failed in what he did, but the first book still ends at a very definitive moment where like Ned has died, Robb has been declared king in the North, Tyrion has come into town to become Hand. there's Arya has left King's Landing. Sansa has been kidnapped, or not kidnapped, but taken hostage. There's and they announced that Jon is going to go north of the Wall. Like, there is a huge transition between what you knew in Game of Thrones and what happens, what now the world of a Clash of Kings. So a Clash of Kings then begins this whole new world where, now Tyrion is hand, and now Jon is on an adventure north of the Wall. And, that ends with the Battle of the Blackwater, which again kind of changes the order. Not as definitively as a Game of Thrones, but Tyrion is no longer hand. Tywin comes in as hand. Jon is now part of the Wildlings rather than, with the Night's Watch. He's defected. There are serious changes that have occurred to all of the characters. While when we look at A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons, all of the characters kind of, yes, Jon's story definitely has a definitive end. So does Dany's, but a lot of the characters are left in cliffhangers where you're not sure where their next stage is coming. There's no solid conclusion. And George R.R. Martin writes this, that he was really felt bad about leaving A Dance with Dragons on a cliffhanger, where
I don't know why he would, because that cliffhanger was fucking awesome. It makes you want to come back and pre-order the next one when the pre-orders are available. I hate cliffhangers, but at the same time I love them. It's one of those things. I'm a whore for cliffhangers, if you will.
Sure, and it's not that the other books didn't have cliffhangers. A Clash of Kings ends with this horrible cliffhanger that George R. R. Martin undoes the next book, where he says that they tell Jon that they're marching on the Wall and that there's going to be this, and you get this idea that, oh my God, the Wildlings are right there. And then the next book starts and no, the Mance Rayder is nowhere close to the Wall, and he's not going to get there for many, 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 many chapters. So it's just, so they kind of undo that. But it's bigger though with A Dance with Dragons, where everything is just kind of on this cliffhanger, and there's no, we don't really know where everything is.
Do you think we'll get with Winds of Winter? Do you think it'll be also be bursting at the seams? Do you think we'll be getting probably the biggest book we've ever seen?
Well, there's only so big a book can be. So when you print books, the binding, there are rules with publishers where the bindings have to be a certain size and stuff. So that it can go to paperback and they can make certain amount of money and stuff like that. So there is a maximum size. So it can't really be bigger than, I think A Storm of Swords is the longest book. It can't really be bigger than A Storm of Swords. So
it can, if you think about the fact that when Dance of Dragons came out, which was 2010, 2011, that's 10 years ago. Ebooks weren't a thing. I mean, they kind of were, not really, kind of, not really. Now they are. So now they're as popular as physical books. You actually definitely could. I wouldn't mind getting part 1 and part 2 for Winds of Winter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's not impossible, but I think there's some big economic pushes to get it to a certain length. It's funny about the 2 books thing, because I would much rather have it, do like you did before, and this time we get half the characters again, but a different half, and then we can wait on the other half. I think that would be fine, but I think George R. R. Martin, somebody asked him that question, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. So, we'll see.
Just hearing about all these supposed lost chapters, I mean, and how big Dance of Dragons was, I can understand why you think A Dream of Spring won't be the last book. I can definitely see that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't think we'll ever get A Dream of Spring, but...
why don't you think we'll ever get A Dream of Spring? Because you always say it to me, but I want to say it again.
Because men are mortal.
That's not. I know what you're implying, but I got you. No, no. I want to hope we get it. I don't want it to be like I believe it's
because
the
because Valar Dohaeris.
good, nice try. Uh, I don't want it to be like the Wheel of
I mean
Time where
Valar Morghulis.
I don't want it to be like the Wheel of Time where the guy that book series, from what I'm told, went on a little too long, and then he died, and they brought in another guy to kind of finish it out. Which, I don't want that to be the case because
Yeah.
if something does happen to George, God forbid, knock on wood, I don't want his. I don't know what you would call those two. You know what I'm talking about. I don't want them to
Yeah.
come in and try to finish it up, or any of his assistants to do so, because I just wouldn't want
Yeah.
that.
I wouldn't want it because I don't, George R. R. Martin is really attentive to detail and he likes to wrap up plot threads. And, I think he would do a good job. And I want him to do that job. I don't think anybody else would take the time and, have the care to do it, to wrap up the plot threads, like every single plot thread.
What's the book that came out a while ago, a couple years ago? It was written by him and then these other two people. Like even that one felt a little, I don't want to say fan fiction-y, but you can definitely tell which sections were his and what were not. And quite frankly,
Oh,
that book,
are you talking about the world of Ice and Fire?
yeah, I feel like that was also prematurely released because I want a definitive dictionary, because Star Trek
Yeah.
gets them, Star Wars gets them, I think Lord of the Rings has one maybe. I want one for Thrones when it's finished, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like the World of Ice and Fire was prematurely released, and a good chunk of it does feel fanficky because you're right. They aren't allowed to go into certain areas that George wants to touch on later in future books.
And here's the thing, and this is a big thing with the Shrouded Lord say, is this and why that chapter was cut. Like George R. R. Martin is balancing, in my opinion, when I read it, and when I read his previous work, he's balancing the level of fantasy versus sci-fi versus realism. And when some people read A Song of Ice and Fire, they see a fantasy book and they think everything is supernatural and prophecy is all coming true. And when other people read it, they see something that there's not that many fantasy elements. And the Shrouded Lord chapter was about that, was about not crossing that line. Because George R. R. Martin thought that a chapter where Tyrion, mystically goes off and like talks to this Shrouded Lord character who, if I were to guess about who the Shrouded Lord is, he's probably another character similar to the House of the Undying or Bloodraven, where he has, an, strange telepathic powers and he can see, and read people's minds and, things like that, and might exist in a hive mind and all of the different elements that George R. R. Martin loves. I would guess that the Shrouded Lord was that, but he wasn't ready. Like George R. R. Martin wasn't ready for another big like mystical character like that on the same level as the House of the Undying or Bloodraven. And
Yeah, it can get crowded with those types of characters. I see what you mean.
right, because it's only in A Dance with Dragons that we're actually introduced to Bloodraven, and we get thrown this entire idea that there's a network of I mean, it's funny to get to this point, right? That in A Dance with Dragons is when we're finally told that, oh yeah, all of those dreams and weird mystical things that were happening to Bran, it's because there's a telepathic network of trees that go all around the continent, that an old man stuck in a tree with like ancient elves like controls. And that's why there's mystical dreams, right? Like a dance with Dragons had a lot that it like shoved on the readers already. So all of a sudden, like rather than accepting like the answer to why there was all these mystical dreams getting sent to Bran is that there is a network of strange alien, well not alien, but strange trees and elf-like beings that live with these trees who have a relay station north of the wall with a super old dude in it who was mystically like sending telepathic stuff like through these trees. And there's time travel, which also allow time travel. Like those brand chapters were like kind of thrown on us, like, and that there's a lot to take in those. And so it might be a lot to throw in the same book that, oh yeah, there's also like this mystical supernatural dude in the middle of the Roin who we've never talked about before, but who also has like the powers to, you know, project himself mystically and telepathically into, and does so to Tyrion.
And the character almost seems a little useless. Like it's a cool addition to just this one chapter, but at the same time, like, is it really necessary? Because it seems like this
Yeah.
character is only mainly focused on this one section in Essos, and it's not like Quaithe who follows Dany everywhere, and it's kind of almost an integral part of her story. This is just kind of like a random thing that Tyrion experiences one time.
Yeah. Um, and who knows? Maybe it'll, you know, maybe it'll come back. I don't know. But it, he did do a lot of weird world building for this Shrouded Lord character and the Stone Man and all of that. But I don't know. It didn't. It was probably for the best that it was cut. Because I'm trying to think like placement wise in the chronology, like that mystical chapter would be happening before maybe Brand 3, where we find out a lot about how the world works, you know. So certain chapters just toss a lot on people. Like Sam 5, like the end of A Feast for Crows, tosses a whole lot on people. And the House of the Undying chapter of Dany, I guess that's Dany 4, like throws a lot on people. And so it would maybe it would have been too much